Sometimes the hardest thing in life is watching someone you love slip away forever. Sometimes the only thing that saves you is a stranger who understands that kind of pain. At Clara Wynn's homestead, where the prairie winds never stop and sorrow lingers like smoke, a giant cowboy appears with trembling hands and eyes swollen with grief. He doesn't ask for food or shelter. He doesn't give a name. He just says, voice cracking, "I lost my daughter today. Can I work for free to clean my head?" Clara, a widow who knows the weight of loss and has buried too many dreams in the soil, nods once. Two broken people find healing through honest work and quiet understanding. But when the town wants him gone, Clara must choose between safety and saving two hearts. What happens when helping someone else heal becomes the key to your own salvation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Bitter Creek, casting long shadows across Clara Wynn's weathered homestead. She sat on her porch steps, watching the stranger work with a precision that spoke of years spent with his hands. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he split logs behind her barn, each swing of the axe clean and purposeful. The sound echoed across the prairie like a heartbeat, steady, reliable, something she hadn't heard in too long. Clara's fingers unconsciously twisted the thin gold band on her left hand, worn smooth by 3 years of widowhood and worry. Thomas had been gone that long now, taken by a fever that swept through the county like wildfire. She'd kept his ring on because taking it off felt like admitting he was really gone, and some mornings she still woke, expecting to hear his voice calling her name from the kitchen. The homestead stretched before her in the fading light, 160 acres of stubborn prairie grass, a half-grown cornfield that fought the wind daily, and a vegetable garden she tended with the fierce determination of someone who knew hunger. The house itself was modest but solid, built by Thomas's own hands from lumber hauled 60 miles from the nearest mill. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as a sitting room, and a root cellar that had saved them through more than one harsh winter. "Mama, who is that man?" 8-year-old Emma peered around the doorframe, her dark hair escaping from the braids Clara had woven that morning. She had Thomas's serious eyes and his way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. "Someone who needs help, sweetheart." Clara reached out and smoothed Emma's hair. "Go wash up for supper. Tell Samuel too." Emma nodded and disappeared back into the house, her bare feet padding across the wooden floors. Clara could hear her calling to her younger brother, 6-year-old Samuel, who was probably building elaborate structures with the wooden blocks Thomas had carved during the last winter of his life. The stranger, he still hadn't given his name, had arrived just as the morning mist was lifting from the creek. Clara had been hanging laundry on the line, listening to the meadowlarks sing their liquid songs, when his shadow fell across her path. He was the largest man she'd ever seen, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to yoke oxen. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his boots caked with the red dust of long miles. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They held a kind of emptiness she recognized, the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. When he spoke those words, "I lost my daughter today. Can I work for free to clean my head?" His voice cracked like a boy's, despite his massive frame. Clara had learned to read grief in the 3 years since Thomas died. She'd seen it in her own mirror often enough. The way it settled in your shoulders made you carry yourself like you were afraid the ground might give way. The way it turned simple tasks into monumental efforts made you forget to eat, made sleep either impossible or the only escape you could find. So when this giant of a man stood before her, hat in his massive hands, asking not for charity, but for the chance to work through his pain, she'd simply nodded and pointed toward the woodpile that had been growing shorter by the day. That was 6 hours ago. In that time, he'd split enough wood to last them through the next month, repaired 3 broken fence posts she'd been meaning to get to since spring, and somehow managed to coax her stubborn pump to work properly again. He moved with the efficiency of someone who knew hard work, but also with the mechanical rhythm of someone trying to outrun his thoughts. Clara rose from the porch steps and walked toward the kitchen. The evening routine was sacred in her house supper at 6, dishes washed and put away by 7, children in bed with a story by 8. It was the structure that had held them together when everything else fell apart. Emma was already setting the table, her small hands careful with the mismatched plates and cups. Samuel sat cross-legged on the floor, building what appeared to be a fort out of his blocks and humming tunelessly to himself. He did that when he was content, and the sound always made Clara's heart lift a little. "Are we setting a place for the man?" Emma asked, her voice holding that careful neutrality children use when they're testing adult decisions. Clara paused, a wooden spoon halfway to the pot of stew she'd been stirring. She hadn't thought about it, but the question hung in the air like smoke. Feeding a stranger was different from letting him work your land. It was inviting him closer, making him part of the evening ritual that belonged to her and her children. "Yes," she heard herself say, "4 places tonight." Emma nodded seriously and retrieved another plate from the cupboard. Samuel looked up from his blocks, blue eyes curious but accepting. He was too young to remember when their table had regularly seated 4, before the fever took his father. To him, this was just another change in a world that seemed to shift constantly around him. Clara ladled the stew into a large bowl and sliced bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning. The smell of beef and vegetables filled the kitchen, mixing with the lingering scent of wood smoke from the morning fire. It was a good smell, the smell of home and sustenance and care. She stepped out onto the porch and called across the yard, "Supper's ready." The stranger looked up from where he was stacking the split wood with military precision. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, as if he hadn't heard her. Then he set down the log he was holding and walked slowly toward the house. He paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with those hollow eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I can make do with what I have in my pack." "I'm sure you can," Clara said quietly. "But my children are curious about you, and I'd rather answer their questions with you here than try to explain why I fed the chickens but not the man who spent all day helping us." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or gratitude. He climbed the steps slowly, as if each one cost him effort, and followed her into the kitchen. Emma and Samuel watched him with the frank curiosity of children as he stood uncertainly by the door. Clara gestured to the chair across from her own. "Please, sit." He lowered himself carefully into the chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. His hands, Clara noticed, were scarred and calloused, but scrupulously clean. He'd washed at the pump before coming in, she realized, probably out of habit more than thought. "I'm Clara Wynn," she said as she served the stew. "These are my children, Emma and Samuel." He nodded to each of them in turn, his manner formal but gentle. "Ma'am, Miss Emma, Master Samuel." Samuel giggled at being called master, and even Emma smiled a little. But the stranger didn't offer his own name, and Clara didn't press. Some things came in their own time. They ate in relative silence, broken only by Samuel's occasional observations about his day, and Emma's polite questions about whether their guest needed more bread or water. The stranger ate steadily, but without enthusiasm, as if food was merely fuel rather than pleasure. "Do you have children?" Emma asked suddenly, her 8-year-old directness cutting through the careful politeness. The stranger's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Clara felt the air in the room grow thick with unspoken pain. "I did," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A daughter." "Where is she now?" Samuel asked innocently. "Samuel," Clara said gently, recognizing the warning signs in the stranger's face. But the man looked directly at the boy, his eyes holding a weight that made Clara's heart ache. "She's with the angels now, son. She went to heaven this morning." Samuel nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact way children approach concepts too large for them to fully grasp. Emma, older and more aware of what death meant, reached across the table and patted the stranger's massive hand with her small one. "I'm sorry," she said simply, When Papa died, Mama cried for a long time. But she says he's watching over us now. The stranger stared down at Emma's small hand on his, and Clara saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Thank you, Miss Emma. That's very kind. After supper, Clara sent the children to get ready for bed, while she and the stranger cleared the table in comfortable silence. He moved carefully in her kitchen, as if afraid his sighs might break something precious. When the dishes were washed and put away, he stood by the door, hat in hand once again. "I'll bed down in your barn, if that's acceptable," he said. "I won't be any trouble." "There's fresh straw in the loft," Clara told him, "and blankets in the chest by the ladder. Help yourself to whatever you need." He nodded and turned to go, then paused. "Ma'am, thank you. For the work, for the meal, for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer." "We all carry our own weight here," Clara said. "You carried yours today." After he left, Clara sat on her porch in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the barn, a man grieved for his lost daughter. Somewhere in her children's room, Emma and Samuel whispered about the giant who'd eaten supper at their table. And somewhere in her own heart, Clara felt the first stirring of something she'd thought was buried with Thomas, the possibility that her family might not always be just the three of them. The ring on her finger caught the last light of the day, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara wondered what it might feel like to take it off. The second morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything look sharper, more defined. Clara was collecting eggs from the hen house when she heard the thud and curse from near the barn. She looked up to see the stranger standing over his fallen saddlebag, its contents scattered across the hard-packed earth. He moved quickly to gather his belongings, but not quickly enough. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw what had spilled out among the practical items: spare clothes, a razor, a worn Bible. There, lying in the dust like a fallen bird, was a child's wooden doll. It was exquisitely carved, no bigger than Clara's hand, with a sweet face and tiny braids painted in careful detail. The wood was smooth from handling, polished by loving fingers, and even from a distance Clara could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its making. This wasn't a store-bought toy. This was something created with infinite patience and love. The stranger knelt and picked up the doll with hands that shook. He cradled it against his chest for a moment, his massive shoulders trembling, before carefully placing it back in the saddlebag. Only then did he notice Clara watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and Clara saw something break open in his face. The careful composure he'd maintained since arriving cracked like ice on a spring pond, and she glimpsed the raw wound beneath. "Her name was Rose," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "She was 7. Clara set down her basket of eggs and walked slowly toward him. She'd learned, in her own grieving, that sometimes people needed to talk and sometimes they needed silence. The trick was knowing which. "Tell me about her," she said simply. He looked down at the saddlebag, his hand still gripping it like a lifeline. She loved horses, wasn't afraid of anything, not storms, not snakes, not the dark. Used to follow me everywhere, chattering like a magpie. His voice broke on the last word. "What happened?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Clara half expected him to close down again, to retreat behind the wall of silence he'd built. Instead, he seemed to collapse inward, aging 10 years in as many seconds. "River crossing," he whispered. Current was stronger than it looked. The wagon started to tip and He stopped, shaking his head. "I tried to reach her. God knows I tried, but the water was so cold, and she was so small, and by the time I got to her, he didn't finish. He didn't need to." Clara had seen enough death to know how this story ended. "I pulled her out," he continued, his voice mechanical now, distant. "Laid her on the bank and tried everything I knew. Pumped her chest, breathed into her lungs, begged God to give her back to me. But she was already gone, already cold." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I buried her under a cottonwood tree by the river. Made a cross from wagon wood and said what words I could remember from the Bible. But it didn't feel real, you know." Like maybe if I just rode away fast enough, I could pretend it never happened, could go back to the morning when she was still alive and laughing. From the house came the sound of children's voices, Emma telling Samuel to wash his face properly, Samuel protesting that he was clean enough. Normal morning sounds, the kind of sounds this man would never hear from his daughter again. "Where were you going?" Clara asked gently. "Before." Didn't matter. He straightened, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Still doesn't. I was taking her to her grandmother in Colorado. Her mother died birthing her, and I thought maybe Rose needed a woman's influence. Guess none of that matters now." Clara watched him struggle to compose himself, this giant of a man brought low by loss. She thought of her own children, asleep in their beds last night, and tried to imagine the world without their voices, their laughter, their endless questions and observations. The thought made her feel physically sick. "You blame yourself," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Course I do. I was her father. I was supposed to protect her." His hands clenched into fists. "Should have found another way across. Should have waited for the water to go down. Should have. Should have done 100 different things," Clara finished. "I know. I've walked that road myself." He looked up at her, surprised. "Your husband?" "Among others." Clara's voice grew distant. "Lost 2 babies before Emma was born, both in the winter months when the doctor couldn't get through. Sat up with them for days, trying every remedy I knew, every prayer I could remember. When they died, I told myself I should have tried harder, done something different." "How do you live with it?" The question was asked so quietly she almost didn't hear it. But the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. This was a man standing at the edge of an abyss, asking for a rope. "Same way you'll live with it," Clara said. "One day at a time, one breath at a time, until the day comes when you remember her laugh before you remember her dying. Until you can think of her without feeling like your chest is caving in." "I don't want to stop feeling it," he said fiercely. "The pain is all I have left of her." "No, it's not." Clara gestured toward the saddlebag. "You have 7 years of memories. You have the sound of her voice, the way she looked when she was sleeping, the way she hugged you when you came home. You have the doll you carved for her, and the love that went into making it. The pain isn't what's left of her, it's just what's left of losing her." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for proof that what she said was true. Before he could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway of the house. "Mama, Samuel can't find his other boot." "Check under his bed," Clara called back. Then, to the stranger, "What's your name? If you're going to be around my children, I need something to call you besides the man." He hesitated then. "Ephraim Boone." "Well, Ephraim Boone, I've got breakfast on the table and 2 children who are curious about you. If you're up for it, you're welcome to join us." Ephraim looked toward the house, where Emma had been joined by Samuel, both children watching the adults with the patient interest of young people waiting for the grown-ups to sort themselves out. "I'm not much company right now," he warned. "Neither was I, for a long time after Thomas died. My children got used to it." Clara picked up her basket of eggs. "Besides, Rose would want you to eat, wouldn't she? To take care of yourself?" At the mention of his daughter's name, Ephraim's face went through a series of emotions: pain, love, something that might have been peace. Finally, he nodded. "She always did fuss at me when I forgot meals," he said quietly. "Used to stand on a chair so she could reach the stove and make me scrambled eggs when she thought I was getting too thin. Then come eat some proper eggs," Clara said. "And maybe you can tell Emma and Samuel what 7-year-olds like to do for fun. They've been living with just me for too long. They could use some different perspective." Ephraim shouldered his saddlebag carefully, making sure the doll was secure inside. As they walked toward the house together, Clara noticed he moved a little differently, still bent with grief, but not quite so broken. As if admitting the truth of what happened had released some small pressure he'd been carrying. The children were waiting at the table, Emma having apparently solved the boot crisis. They looked up as Ephraim entered, and Clara saw something pass between Thema kind of recognition, maybe the way children sometimes understand things adults miss. "Mr. Boone is going to have breakfast with us," Clara announced, "and maybe he'll tell you about his daughter Rose." Samuel brightened immediately. "Did she like to build things?" "I like to build things." Ephraim sat down carefully, his large frame dwarfing the chair. For a moment, Clara thought he might retreat again, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of children's questions. Then something shifted in his expression, and when he spoke, his voice held the first note of warmth she'd heard from him. "She loved to build things," he said, "especially towers out of river rocks. She could stack them higher than her head without them falling down." And for the first time since arriving, Ephraim Boone smiled. The days that followed took on a rhythm that surprised Clara with its naturalness. Ephraim rose before dawn and worked until the sun set, tackling every task she could think of and several she hadn't. He reinforced the chicken coop against winter predators, repaired loose boards on the barn, and somehow coaxed her stubborn well pump to deliver water with less coaxing and profanity. But it was the small things that caught her attention, the way he gathered kindling without being asked, stacking it precisely by the kitchen door. How he'd oil the hinges on the barn door so they wouldn't squeak and wake the children at dawn. The careful way he mended her broken garden gate, not just fixing it but improving it. On the fourth morning, Clara found something new on her kitchen windowsill, a wooden spoon, carved from what looked like apple wood, smooth as silk and perfectly balanced. It was beautiful in its simplicity, functional but crafted with an attention to detail that spoke of hours of patient work. She picked it up, running her fingers along the handle. The wood was warm to the touch, worn smooth by Ephraim's hands during the carving. It fit her palm perfectly, as if he'd somehow measured her grip without her knowing. "Do you like it?" Clara turned to find Ephraim standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncertain. For such a large man, he moved remarkably quietly. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "but you don't need to." "Wanted to," he said simply. "Saw you struggling with that old spoon yesterday, handle all cracked and ready to break. Figured I could do better." Clara tested the weight of it, stirring the porridge she was making for breakfast. It moved through the thick mixture effortlessly, the long handle keeping her knuckles clear of the hot pot. "Where did you learn to carve like this?" "My father. He was a cabinet maker back in Missouri before we moved west. Said a man should be able to make something useful with his hands, something that would last." Ephraim's voice grew quiet. "Used to carve toys for Rose, made her a whole set of farm animals one Christmas." Clara saw him glance toward his saddlebag, where she knew the wooden doll rested among his few possessions. She must have loved them. Played with them every day, even took her favoritar little horse to bed with her. He cleared his throat. "Anyway, I thought you might have use for a proper spoon." Before Clara could respond, Emma and Samuel tumbled into the kitchen, already dressed and eager for breakfast. Samuel's hair stuck up in several directions, despite Clara's attempts to smooth it down, and Emma had somehow managed to get dirt on her dress between the bedroom and the kitchen. "Mr. Boone," Samuel called out with the familiarity of a child who'd decided someone was trustworthy, "are you going to show us how to whittle today?" "Samuel," Clara began, but Ephraim held up a hand. "Told them yesterday I might teach them some basics," he explained. "If that's all right with you, nothing sharp, just how to shape wood with a dull knife, sand it smooth." Emma bounced on her toes. "He said he could show us how to make whistles." Clara looked between her children's eager faces and Ephraim's carefully neutral expression. She suspected this offer meant more to him than he was letting on a chance to share something he'd once taught his own daughter. "After chores," she said, "and only if you mind everything Mr. Boone tells you about being careful." The children cheered and attacked their breakfast with renewed enthusiasm, chattering about what they wanted to carve. Ephraim ate more slowly, but Clara noticed he cleaned his plate completely the first time since he'd arrived, that he'd shown any real appetite. After breakfast, Clara watched from the kitchen window as Ephraim settled on a tree stump with Emma and Samuel flanking him on smaller stumps they'd dragged over. He'd found pieces of soft pine and dulled an old knife until it was safe for small hands to use. The lesson began with wood selection, how to find pieces without knots or cracks, how to feel for the grain. Then came the basics of holding the knife, always cutting away from yourself, taking small shavings rather than trying to remove large chunks. Emma approached the task with typical seriousness, tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on following Ephraim's instructions exactly. Samuel was more enthusiastic than precise, but Ephraim patiently guided his hands, showing him again and again how to control the knife. "No, son, like this," Clara heard him say, his large hands covering Samuel's small ones. "Feel how the wood wants to split. We work with it, not against it." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The gentleness in Ephraim's voice, the natural way he'd called Samuel, "son," was the voice of a man who'd spent years teaching a child, who missed that role so deeply it ached. She watched Samuel look up at Ephraim with something approaching adoration. Her youngest had been barely 3 when Thomas died, and while he remembered his father in fragments of voice, a laugh, strong hands lifting him high, he had no real memory of what it felt like to have a father's daily presence. Emma, older and more cautious with her affections, was nonetheless clearly charmed by Ephraim's patient instruction. When her knife slipped and she accidentally gouged her piece of wood, she looked up at him with tears threatening. "I ruined it," she said, her voice small. Ephraim examined the wood carefully, turning it in his hands. "Well now, let's see. You've got a choice here, Miss Emma. You can start over with a new piece, or you can figure out how to make this gouge part of your design." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes the wood tells us what it wants to become. This here," he pointed to the accidental cut, "this could be the mouth of a bird, or maybe a little door in a house. The trick is learning to see what's possible instead of just what went wrong." Emma studied the wood with new interest. "Could it be a fish, with the mouth open?" "I think it could be a fine fish," Ephraim agreed. "Want to try?" For the next hour, Clara found herself neglecting her own work to watch the impromptu woodworking lesson. There was something healing in the sight of Ephraim's grief temporarily set aside, his attention focused entirely on teaching her children. And there was something equally healing in watching Emma and Samuel respond to his quiet guidance, soaking up attention they hadn't realized they'd been missing. When Mrs. Patterson's wagon appeared on the horizon, Clara felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Dolores Patterson was the nearest neighbor, a woman with strong opinions about propriety and an unfortunate tendency to share those opinions freely. She was also the unofficial source of news and gossip for their scattered community. Clara smoothed her apron and walked out to greet her visitor, hoping to intercept any awkward questions before Mrs. Patterson got close enough to the woodcarving lesson to start making assumptions. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Patterson called out as she climbed down from her wagon with some difficulty. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with graying hair pinned severely back and a face that seemed naturally arranged in lines of disapproval. "I was passing by and thought I'd stop to see how you're managing." "We're doing well, thank you," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be lovely." Mrs. Patterson's eyes had already found Ephraim and the children, and Clara could practically see the questions forming. "I see you have company." "A man looking for work," Clara said carefully. "He's been helpful with some repairs around the place." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "A stranger, Clara, dear, is that wise? A woman alone with 2 children." "I'm perfectly safe," Clara interrupted, her voice firm. "Mr. Boone is a gentleman. I'm sure he seems to be, but you never know with drifters. Where did he come from? Where is he going? What do you really know about him?" The questions hit closer to home than Clara wanted to admit. She didn't know much about Ephraim beyond his grief and his skill with his hands. But she knew the way he looked at her children with a gentle protectiveness that reminded her of Thomas. She knew he worked harder than any hired hand she'd ever seen, asking for nothing but a place to sleep and whatever food she could spare. "I know enough," she said. "He's helped us more in 4 days than—" "Mama," Samuel's voice interrupted, high with excitement. "Look what I made." He came running over, holding up a piece of wood that had been roughly shaped into something that might charitably be called a whistle. Ephraim and Emma followed more slowly, Emma cradling her fish, carving protectively. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Clara said, taking the whistle and examining it with appropriate admiration. "Does it work?" Samuel put it to his lips and produced a breathy, off-key sound that was more air than music. His face lit up with pride. Mrs. Patterson looked from the children to Ephraim, her expression unreadable. "You're teaching them woodworking?" "Basic whittling," Ephraim replied quietly, his hat once again in his hands. "Keeps them busy while their mother works." "How thoughtful," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "And you're staying where exactly?" "The barn," Ephraim answered. "Mrs. Wynn's been kind enough to allow me to work for my keep." "I see." Mrs. Patterson's gaze moved between Clara and Ephraim, and Clara could almost hear the calculations being made. "Well, I'm sure it's temporary." "Very temporary," Ephraim agreed, though something in his voice suggested the words cost him effort. After Mrs. Patterson left, taking with her promises to check in again soon, Clara found herself standing in her kitchen, staring out the window at Ephraim as he cleaned up the woodcarving area. The children had run off to play with their new creations, leaving him alone with his thoughts. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's questions, about the assumptions that would inevitably follow. A widow woman, living alone with a strange man. The talk that would start, the pressure that would build. But then she looked at the wooden spoon in her hand, felt its perfect weight and smooth finish. She thought about Samuel's delighted laugh when his whistle actually made a sound, about Emma's careful concentration as she shaped her wooden fish. Some things, Clara decided, were worth a little gossip. Some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was the endless, echoing silence that had filled her house for too long. Outside, Ephraim had finished cleaning up and was walking toward the barn. But instead of the defeated slouch he'd carried when he arrived, there was something different in his posterior straightness, a purpose. Maybe, Clara thought, she wasn't the only one finding reasons to take risks. A week later, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm echoing across the yard, and realized she'd grown accustomed to the sounds of Ephraim's work. The creak of the barn door at dawn, the whisper of the axe through wood, the careful footsteps of a large man trying not to wake sleeping children. She dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl against the morning chill. The sight that greeted her made her catch her breath. Ephraim had found the old oak tree behind the house, the one Thomas had always said would make a perfect place for a swing if he ever found the time to build one. Now, suspended from its strongest branch by 2 lengths of rope, hung a simple wooden seat, sanded smooth and sized perfectly for a child. Emma and Samuel stood beneath it in their nightgowns, staring up at the swing with wonder. They must have heard the hammering and crept out to investigate, the way children do when something magical appears in their world. "Can we try it?" Emma asked, her voice hushed with reverence. Ephraim, who was testing the ropes one final time, looked toward the porch where Clara stood. "That's up to your mother," he said. Clara walked over, running her hands along the ropes to check their security. The knots were perfect, the kind of knots a man learns when his life might depend on their holding. The seat was carved from a single piece of oak, worn smooth as silk and shaped to cradle a child safely. "When did you have time to make this?" she asked. "Evenings," Ephraim replied. "After you all went to bed. Found the wood in your husband's lumber pile hope. That's all right. Seemed like it was waiting for the right purpose." Clara nodded, her throat tight. Thomas had saved that piece of oak for something special, though he'd never said what. Somehow, Ephraim had found exactly the right use for it. "Emma first," Clara said, "since she's the oldest." Emma approached the swing with the careful reverence of someone being handed something precious. Ephraim lifted her onto the seat, his large hands gentle as he made sure she was secure. "Hold tight to the ropes," he instructed. "Lean back a little. Pump your legs when you want to go higher." He gave her a gentle push, and Emma soared out over the yard, her delighted laugh ringing across the prairie. Clara felt tears sting her eyelid Had been too long since she'd heard that sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Samuel was practically vibrating with excitement, dancing from foot to foot as he waited his turn. When Emma finally relinquished the swing, he scrambled onto it with less grace, but equal enthusiasm. "Higher," he called out as Ephraim pushed him. "I want to touch the clouds." Clara watched Ephraim's face as he obliged, giving Samuel a stronger push that sent him soaring. For the first time since he'd arrived, the lines of grief around Ephraim's eyes softened into something approaching peace. When Samuel squealed with delight, Ephraim actually smiled, a real smile, not the careful, polite expression he usually wore. "Did Rose like to swing?" Emma asked during her second turn, with the directness that children bring to difficult subjects. Clara tensed, afraid the question might shatter the fragile joy of the moment, but Ephraim's smile only grew sadder, not disappearing entirely. "She loved it," he said quietly. "Used to swing for hours, singing songs she'd make up, said it felt like flying." "What kind of songs?" Samuel wanted to know. Ephraim was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, very softly, he began to humor simple, lilting melody that seemed to dance on the morning air. After a few bars, he added words, little bird flying so high, over the prairie and into the sky. Where do you go when the day is done? Home to your nest when you're tired of fun." His voice was surprisingly good, a warm baritone that wrapped around the simple words and made them beautiful. Emma and Samuel listened with rapt attention, swinging gently as the song filled the space between them. "Did Rose write that?" Emma asked when he finished. "She did. Made it up one afternoon when she was supposed to be napping." Ephraim's voice held equal parts love and loss. "She said little birds didn't take naps, so why should she?" Clara found herself smiling through her tears. She could picture if a 7-year-old girl with her father's stubborn streak, turning nap time into song time. "She sounds like she was quite a character." "She was that," Ephraim agreed. "Never met a rule she couldn't find a way around, or a person she couldn't charm into seeing things her way." "Like Emma," Samuel observed with 7-year-old logic. "Emma's good at getting around rules too." Emma looked indignant at this assessment, but before she could protest, Ephraim chuckled the first sound of genuine amusement Clara had heard from him. "Is that so?" he asked, looking at Emma with mock seriousness. "What kind of rules does Miss Emma get around?" "She told Mama she was too sick for chores last week, but then she felt better enough to play outside," Samuel reported gleefully. "Samuel!" Emma protested, her cheeks flushing. "Smart girl," Ephraim said solemnly. "Rose would have liked that trick. She once convinced me she was too weak from a stomachache to help with dishes, but somehow felt well enough to go fishing an hour later." "What did you do?" Clara asked, curious despite herself. "Took her fishing," Ephraim replied. "Figured if she was well enough to try to outsmart me, she was well enough to clean the fish we caught." The children giggled at this, and Clara found herself laughing too. There was something healing about sharing these stories, these glimpses into the life Ephraim had lived with his daughter. It made Rose real to them, gave her a place in their mourning that didn't center entirely on her death. After breakfast, Clara sent the children to gather eggs while she tackled the laundry. She was hanging sheets on the line when she noticed Ephraim working near the barn, humming the same tune he'd sung earlier. The sound drifted across the yard, mixing with the prairie wind and the distant calls of meadowlarks. There was something different about him today, she realized. The set of his shoulders was less rigid, his movements less mechanical. The swinger, maybe the children's joy in I had loosened something in him, allowed some of the life to seep back into his grief. "Mrs. Wynn?" Clara turned to find Emma standing beside her, a basket of eggs in one hand and a thoughtful expression on her face. "Yes, sweetheart? Is Mr. Boone going to stay with us?" The question caught Clara off guard. She'd been trying not to think too hard about the future, taking each day as it came. But Emma was 8 years old and smart enough to recognize that nothing lasted forever. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "Why do you ask?" Emma shifted the egg basket to her other hand, considering her words carefully. Samuel really likes him, and he's teaching us things Papa never had time to teach us. Clara felt a pang at the casual mention of Thomas, the way children accept loss and move forward in ways adults struggle to manage. What kinds of things? Boy things, I guess. How to whittle, how to tie good knots, how to fix things that are broken. Emma paused. He's not trying to be Papa, but he's what, honey? He's like having a grown-up around who knows about different stuff than you do, Emma said finally, and he makes Samuel laugh. Clara looked across the yard to where Samuel was pestering Ephraim with questions about the proper way to stack wood. Ephraim was patiently demonstrating the technique, his large hands guiding Samuel's small ones as they built a neat pile together. He makes you laugh too, Clara observed. Emma ducked her head, suddenly shy. He's nice, and he listens when we talk, not like some grown-ups who just pretend to listen. That afternoon, while the children napped, Clara found herself sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a pile of mending. Ephraim was repairing a section of fence that had been sagging since spring, working with the steady efficiency she'd come to expect from him. She watched him work and found herself thinking about Emma's question. Was Ephraim going to stay? And if he was, what did that mean for all of them? The practical part of her mind catalogued the benefits, the work that got done, the repairs she could never have managed alone, the way her children's faces lit up when he taught them something new. But there was more to it than that, though she was reluctant to examine those feelings too closely. It had been 3 years since she'd had another adult to share the daily concerns of life with. 3 years of making every decision alone, carrying every worry by herself. Ephraim's presence had eased that burden in ways she was only beginning to understand. But Mrs. Patterson's visit had reminded her that not everyone would see the arrangement as innocent. A widow woman and an unmarried man, living on the same property, it would cause talk, possibly serious trouble. As if summoned by her thoughts, Ephraim approached the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Fence is secure now," he reported. "Should hold through the winter." "Thank you," Clara said. "You've done more work in a week than I managed in the past month." Ephraim settled onto the porch steps, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Feels good to be useful again. Been a while since I had a reason to fix things, instead of just letting them fall apart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds build on the horizon. Finally, Clara spoke. "Mrs. Patterson will be back," she said quietly, "probably with questions." "I know." Ephraim's voice was equally quiet. "Want me to move on before that happens?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Clara found herself studying his profile, noting the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful way he held his hands to keep them from trembling. "Do you want to move on?" she asked. Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't. But wanting something and being able to have it aren't always the same thing." Clara thought about Emma's observation, about Samuel's laughter, about the way the house felt less empty with Ephraim's presence filling the spaces Thomas had left behind. "Mrs. Patterson can ask all the questions she wants," Clara said. "But this is my land, my home, my decision." Ephraim turned to look at her, surprise, and something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. "Besides," Clara continued, "someone needs to teach Samuel how to build those rock towers Rose used to make, and Emma's going to need help with that fish carving." For the first time since she'd known him, Ephraim Boone smiled without any sadness behind it. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the prairie wind, Clara could swear she heard the echo of a little girl's laughter, approving of the life slowly blooming again in the shadow of her loss. 3 weeks after Ephraim's arrival, autumn settled over Bitter Creek with the finality of a closing door. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the prairie grass whispered with the dry rustle of another season ending. Clara stood in her garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard frost could claim them. She was pulling carrots when Ephraim appeared beside her, moving with that quiet grace that still surprised her. In his large hands, he held something small and delicately-pressed flower, deep red and perfectly preserved, between the pages of what looked like a Bible. "Rose," he said simply, holding it out for Clara to see. Clara wiped her hands on her apron before taking the flower. It was a wild rose, the kind that grew along creek beds and in protected hollows. The petals had kept their color despite being pressed, and Clara could see why someone had thought it worth saving. She picked it the morning we left for Colorado. Ephraim continued, his voice soft with memory. Said it was too pretty to leave behind, so she put it in my Bible for safekeeping. I'd forgotten about it until last night. Clara studied the flower, imagining a 7-year-old girl carefully placing it between the pages, trusting her father to keep it safe. It's beautiful. She had a good eye. She could spot beauty in the smallest things, a bird's nest, a perfect stone, the way light hit water just right. Ephraim's voice grew distant. Used to drive me crazy sometimes, how she'd want to stop and examine every little thing on the trail. I was always pushing to make better time, get to the next town, finish whatever business I had. Now I'd give anything to have one more day of her slowing me down to look at flowers. Clara handed the pressed rose back to him, understanding the weight of such regrets. I used to get impatient with Thomas about his woodworking. He'd spend hours in the barn, shaping some piece of furniture or carving something decorative, and I'd think about all the practical things that needed doing. Now I wish I'd spent more time watching him work, learning what brought him such peace in those quiet hours. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, Clara harvesting vegetables while Ephraim gathered the fallen apples from her small orchard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the homestead, and somewhere in the distance, Emma and Samuel's voices carried on the wind as they played by the creek. "Mrs. Wynn," Ephraim said suddenly, his voice careful, "I want you to know if my being here causes you trouble with the townspeople, you just say the word and I'll move on. I don't want to bring hardship on you and the children." Clara straightened, a bunch of carrots in her hands. "What brought this on?" "Been thinking about what that Patterson woman said, about what people might assume." Ephraim kept his eyes on the apples he was gathering. "A man in my position references, no past anyone can verify. Maybe it's not fair to ask you to take that risk." Before Clara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. She looked up to see Sheriff Bradley approaching, his badge catching the afternoon light. Behind him rode 2 other men she recognized from town council members who rarely ventured out to the homesteads unless there was trouble. "Afternoon, Clara," Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted. He was a lean man in his 40s, with careful eyes and the measured manner of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Just garden work," Clara replied, though her stomach had begun to tighten with apprehension. "What brings you out our way, Sheriff?" Bradley's gaze moved to Ephraim, who had straightened to his full height and was watching the exchange with wary attention. "Actually, we came to have a word with your hired man here, if that's all right." "He's not exactly hired," Clara said carefully. "More of a work arrangement." "I see." Bradley's tone remained neutral, but Clara caught the glance that passed between him and the other men. "Mind if we ask your name, mister?" "Ephraim Boone," Ephraim replied, his voice steady. "And where are you from, Mr. Boone?" "Originally Missouri. Been traveling for a while now." Sheriff Bradley nodded, making notes in a small book he'd pulled from his pocket. "What kind of work did you do before you started traveling?" Clara watched Ephraim's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Farming mostly. Some carpentry. Whatever needed doing." "Any particular reason you left Missouri?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara could see Ephraim struggling with how much truth to reveal, how much of his grief to expose to these strangers who'd arrived with suspicion in their eyes. "Personal loss," Ephraim said finally, "needed a change of scenery." One of the council members, a portly man named Hendricks, spoke up for the first time. "That's pretty vague, friend. In times like these, with all the trouble we've been having with drifters and such, folks get nervous about strangers who won't talk about their past." "What kind of trouble?" Clara asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Thefts, mostly, Sheriff Bradley explained. Stock disappearing, supplies going missing from homesteads. Always seems to happen after some stranger passes through town. Clara felt her temper beginning to rise. Are you accusing Mr. Boone of something, Sheriff? Not accusing, just asking questions. It's my job to keep the peace, Clara, and that means knowing who's living in my county. He's been here 3 weeks, Clara said firmly. In that time, he's worked harder than any 3 men I've ever seen. He's helped with my children, fixed things around the property, and hasn't asked for anything but a place to sleep and meals. If you're looking for a thief, you're looking in the wrong direction. Sheriff Bradley raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm sure he's been helpful, Clara. But you have to understand, a woman alone with 2 children, taking in a stranger with no references, it makes people nervous. People like Mrs. Patterson, you mean? Bradley's slight smile confirmed Clara's suspicion about the source of this visit. People like several concerned citizens who worry about your welfare. Ephraim stepped forward, and Clara noticed how the 3 men unconsciously moved back slightly, reminded of his impressive size. Sheriff, if you've got specific questions about my character or my intentions, I'd rather you ask them directly instead of talking around me like I'm not here. Fair enough, Bradley said. Are you wanted by the law anywhere, Mr. Boone? No, sir. Ever been arrested for anything? No, sir. Can you provide references from your last place of employment? Ephraim's pause was barely perceptible, but Clara caught it. No, sir. Like I said, I've been traveling for a while. Hendricks frowned. That seems convenient. How are we supposed to know what kind of man you are if nobody can vouch for you? You could try asking the woman whose land you're standing on, Clara interjected, her voice sharp with anger. I can vouch for him just fine. Clara, Sheriff Bradley said gently, we're not questioning your judgment, but 3 weeks isn't very long to really know someone. Long enough to know he's never raised his voice to my children, never taken anything that wasn't freely given, never made me feel unsafe in my own home. Clara shot back, which is more than I can say for some men who've lived in this county their whole lives. The rebuke hit home, and she saw Bradley wince slightly. There had been incidents over the years, men who drank too much, who treated their families poorly, who caused real trouble. Yet those men weren't facing interrogation in their own yards. Look, Ephraim said quietly, I understand your concerns, Sheriff. A stranger showing up, no history anyone can check. I know how that looks. But I give you my word that I mean no harm to Mrs. Wynn or her children. If my presence here troubles the community, I'll move on. That's not necessary, Clara said quickly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. This is my property, and I'll decide who stays and who goes. Sheriff Bradley studied the 2 of them for a long moment, clearly noting the protective way Clara had positioned herself slightly in front of Ephraim. The way Ephraim's hands had clenched into fists at the suggestion he might be unwelcome. All right, he said finally, I've said my piece, but Clara, if anything at all makes you uncomfortable, you send word to town immediately. Promise me that. I promise, Clara said, though she had no intention of sending word about anything related to Ephraim. After the men rode away, Clara and Ephraim stood in the garden, the tension of the encounter still hanging between them like smoke. Thank you, Ephraim said quietly, for standing up for me. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Clara replied, because what you said to the sheriff was true. You've never made me feel unsafe. Just the opposite, actually. Ephraim turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression. What do you mean? Clara considered her words carefully. I mean, I sleep better knowing you're in the barn. I mean, my children are happier than they've been since their father died. I mean, this place feels like a home again, instead of just a place where we're surviving. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ephraim reached into his pocket and pulled out the pressed rose again, looking down at it with eyes that held both sorrow and something that might have been hope. Rose would have liked you, he said softly. She always said you could tell a lot about people by how they treated strangers. What would she have thought about you staying here? Ephraim smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded. She would have said that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born to. As if summoned by the mention of family, Emma and Samuel came running across the yard, their faces flushed with excitement and their clothes bearing evidence of their afternoon adventures. "Mama," Samuel called out, "we built a dam across the creek and now there's a pond big enough for frogs." "Mr. Boone," Emma added, "come see what we made." Clara watched Ephraim's face transform as the children tugged at his hands, leading him toward their latest creation. The grief was still there, it always would be, but it no longer dominated his features. Instead, there was life, purpose, the kind of contentment that came from being needed and wanted. Following behind them, Clara fingered the wedding ring she still wore and wondered if Thomas would understand that loving someone new didn't mean forgetting someone who came before. Some loves, she was beginning to realize, didn't replace other loves, they simply found new spaces in a heart willing to expand. The first snow arrived early that year, dusting the prairie with white, while the last autumn flowers still bloomed in sheltered spots. Clara woke to the sight of Ephraim's tracks leading from the barn to the house, where he'd already started the morning fire and set coffee to brewing. It had become his routinizing before dawn to ensure her day started with warmth. She found him in the kitchen, standing over the stove in stocking feet, his boots set neatly by the door to dry. His hair was damp from melted snow, and he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone trying not to wake sleeping children. "Morning," she said softly. He turned, offering a small smile. "Morning. Thought you might want coffee before you face the weather." Clara accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. Through the window, she could see that the snow was still falling, not heavily, but with the steady persistence that suggested it meant to stay. "Your boots," she said, noting the way water had seeped through the cracked leather. "They're not going to last the winter." Ephraim glanced down at his feet, then at the boots by the door. "They'll do." "No, they won't." Clara set down her coffee and walked to the bedroom she'd once shared with Thomas. From the closet, she retrieved a pair of brown leather boots, well-made and barely worn. Thomas had bought them the autumn before he died, intending to break them in gradually. He'd never had the chance. When she returned to the kitchen, Ephraim was staring at the boots in her hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. "These were Thomas's," she said simply. "He only wore them a few times. They're just sitting in the closet, not doing anyone any good." Ephraim's throat worked as he swallowed. "Mrs. Wynn, I couldn't—" "Clara," she corrected gently. "And yes, you could. Thomas was about your size, and he would have wanted them to be useful to someone who needed them." She held out the boots, waiting. For a long moment, Ephraim just stared at them, and Clara wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then, slowly, he reached out and took them. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This means more than you know." Clara watched him sit down and pull on the boots, lacing them with careful attention. They fit well, she noticed with satisfaction. Thomas had always had good judgment about practical things. "Mama," Emma's voice drifted from the bedroom. "Is it snowing?" "It is, sweetheart. Come see." The children emerged from their bedroom in nightgowns and bare feet, rushing to the window to press their noses against the cold glass. Samuel's delighted squeal woke the last corners of the house. "Can we go out in it?" he asked, bouncing with excitement. "Can we build a snowman?" "After breakfast and chores," Clara promised, "and after you're dressed in warm clothes." Ephraim stood, testing the fit of his new boots. "I'll get the animals fed and the stalls mucked before the snow gets too deep." As he reached for his coat, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning quiet. Clara felt her stomach drop. Visitors this early usually meant trouble. Sheriff Bradley rode into the yard, leading a small group of men, but this time their faces held grim purpose instead of mere suspicion. Clara recognized most of them: town council members, prominent businessmen, even the bank president. This wasn't a casual inquiry. "Clara," Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted, "we need to talk to your hired man again." "What about?" Clara asked, though dread was already settling in her chest like a cold stone. Instead of answering, Bradley reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Even from a distance, Clara could see the word "wanted" printed across the top in bold letters. "This came in on yesterday's stage," Bradley said, holding up the poster. "From Canyon County, about 200 miles north of here." Clara's heart began to race as Bradley unfolded the poster completely. There, rendered in crude but recognizable detail, was a sketch of Ephraim's face. Below it, in stark black letters, were the words, "Wanted for robbery and murder, 500 reward." "No," Clara breathed, but even as she said it, she could see the resemblance was unmistakable. Ephraim had gone very still beside her, his face pale but composed. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I think you'd better come inside." They gathered around Clara's kitchen tableau, odd collection of law enforcement and accusation, crowding into the space where Clara's family shared their meals. Emma and Samuel, sensing the tension, had retreated to their bedroom without being asked. Sheriff Bradley spread the wanted poster on the table, and Clara found herself staring at the charges listed beneath Ephraim's description. Robbery of Canyon County Bank. Murder of bank president Martin Cooley. Armed and extremely dangerous. "Well," Bradley said, looking directly at Ephraim. "Care to explain this?" Ephraim stared down at the poster for a long moment, his hands flat on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but hollow. "The face is mine," he said, "but I didn't commit those crimes." "That's what they all say," muttered Hendricks. "I was in Canyon County," Ephraim continued, ignoring the interruption, 3 months ago, but I was there trying to save my daughter's life, not rob any bank." Clara felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. The timeline was wrong. If this had happened 3 months ago, it would have been around the time Rose died. "Tell me what happened," Bradley said, his tone more curious than hostile. Ephraim's jaw tightened, and Clara could see the cost of reliving that time. Rose had been sick for days, fever, trouble breathing. "I took her to Canyon County because they had a doctor there, someone with real medical training. And we got there the morning the bank was robbed. Rose was so sick I carried her straight to the doctor's office. He said it was pneumonia, that she needed medicine and rest." Ephraim's voice cracked slightly. "While I was with her, someone robbed the bank and killed the president. By the time I heard about it, Rose Washi was already gone." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Clara found herself studying Ephraim's face, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was the same raw grief she'd witnessed when he told her about losing Rose. "So you're saying it's a case of mistaken identity?" Bradley asked. "Has to be. Someone who looked like me, maybe, or someone who knew I was in town and decided to use my face." Ephraim met the sheriff's eyes directly. "I never set foot in that bank, Sheriff. I was holding my dying daughter's hand while someone else was committing murder." Councilmember Hendricks leaned forward aggressively. "That's a convenient story, but how do we verify it? The doctor who treated your daughter, what was his name?" "Dr. Morrison." Ephraim's response was immediate. "Office above the general store on Main Street. And I suppose he'll vouch for you." Ephraim's pause was barely perceptible, but Clara caught it. "Dr. Morrison died in a fire 2 weeks after Rose passed. His office burned down with all his records." The men around the table exchanged glances, and Clara could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. How convenient. How very convenient. "Look," Bradley said finally, "I believe you might be telling the truth, Mr. Boone, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a warrant out for your arrest. I have to take you in." "No." The word burst from Clara's lips before she could stop it. "You can't." "Clara, I don't have a choice. The law is the law." Clara stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "The law says a man is innocent until proven guilty. All you have is a poster with a drawing that might look like Ephraim. That's not proof of anything." "It's enough for an arrest," Bradley said gently. "Then we can sort out the truth." "And what happens to him while you're sorting out the truth? He sits in jail for months waiting for trial. Or maybe he just happens to have an accident while in custody." Clara's voice grew sharp with fear and anger. "I've heard stories about what happens to men who can't prove their innocence." Ephraim reached out and touched her arm gently. "Clara, it's all right. If this is what needs to happen." It's not all right, Clara interrupted, pulling away from his touch. Nothing about this is all right. She walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow that had transformed her yard into something beautiful and strange. Behind her, she could hear the men discussing logistics, when to leave for town, what charges to file, how to transport a dangerous prisoner. Dangerous prisoner. The words made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. This was the man who carved whistles for her children, who built swings and sang lullabies, who rose before dawn to start her fire. If Ephraim Boone was dangerous, then Clara had forgotten what safety looked like. She turned back to the table, her mind made up. Sheriff Bradley, what would it take to convince you that Ephraim is innocent? Bradley looked surprised by the question. Evidence, I suppose. Witnesses who could place him somewhere else during the robbery. Something concrete. And if such evidence existed, you'd be willing to investigate before making an arrest. Clara, what are you getting at? Clara looked directly at Ephraim, seeing something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Not just grief, but secrecy. He was hiding something, she realized. Not guilt, but something else. Something that might save him if he could be convinced to reveal it. I'm getting at the fact that innocent men don't usually travel with nothing but grief and the clothes on their backs, Clara said carefully, unless they're running from something other than the law. Understanding dawned in Ephraim's eyes, followed quickly by panic. Clara, don't. Don't what? Don't try to save your life. Clara moved to stand beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. Whatever you're protecting, whatever you think you need to hide, can't be worse than hanging for a crime you didn't commit. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the whisper of snow against the windows. Then Ephraim closed his eyes, looking like a man preparing to lose everything he had left. There's something I need to show you, he said quietly. Something I've been carrying since the day Rose died. He stood and walked to the door, reaching for his coat. It's in my saddlebag, in the barn. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. I'll come with you. We all will, Clara said firmly, because whatever Ephraim was about to reveal, she intended to be there to face it with him, whatever the cost. The barn felt smaller with 6 adults, crowded into its dim interior, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ephraim moved toward his makeshift bed in the loft, but instead of climbing the ladder, he knelt beside his saddlebag on the floor below. Clara watched his hands shake as he unbuckled the leather straps. Whatever he was about to reveal had cost him tremendous effort to keep hidden, and she found herself holding her breath as he reached inside. What he withdrew made her gasp. It was an envelope, yellowed with age and handling, but sealed with wax and bearing an official-looking stamp. More importantly, it was addressed to the Honorable Judge William Hartwell, Canyon County Courthouse. What is that? Sheriff Bradley asked, moving closer. Ephraim stared down at the envelope, as if it contained his own death warrant. A letter, he said quietly, from Dr. Morrison, written the day Rose died, before the bank robbery ever happened. What kind of letter? Bradley pressed. Ephraim's throat worked as he swallowed hard. A testimony about what happened to Rose, about my whereabouts during the time she was dying. Dr. Morrison wrote it because he knew I was going to be blamed for something. Clara felt her heart stop. What do you mean he knew? Instead of answering, Ephraim carefully broke the wax seal and withdrew several sheets of paper covered in careful handwriting. His voice, when he began to read, was barely above a whisper. To whom it may concern. I, Dr. James Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby testify to the following facts regarding the death of Rose Boone and the whereabouts of her father. Ephraim Boone, on the morning of September 15th, 1869. He paused, looking up at the circle of faces surrounding him. The day of the bank robbery. Go on, Bradley said, his voice gentler now. Ephraim's hands trembled as he continued reading. Rose Boone was brought to my office at approximately 6 in the morning, suffering from advanced pneumonia. Her father, Ephraim Boone, remained with her continuously from that time until her death at 11:47 in the morning. During this period, Mr. Boone never left my office, not even for a moment. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she imagined Ephraim sitting beside his dying daughter, holding her hand as her life slipped away. "The bank robbery," Sheriff Bradley said quietly. "What time did it happen?" 10:30, replied one of the other men. "I remember because the stage driver mentioned it when he brought news to our town." Ephraim continued reading, his voice growing stronger. "I write this testimony because I fear Mr. Boone may be falsely accused of crimes committed during his daughter's final hours. Earlier this week, I was approached by a man claiming to represent certain business interests in Canyon County. This man, who gave his name as James Hartwell, asked detailed questions about strangers in town, particularly those matching Mr. Boone's description." "Hartwell," Bradley muttered. "Any relation to Judge Hartwell?" "His son," Ephraim said grimly. "Keep listening." This man seemed unusually interested in Mr. Boone's daily routine and whereabouts. When I refused to provide information about my patients, he became hostile and suggested that Mr. Boone's daily routine, Boone might soon find himself in serious legal trouble. He also mentioned that certain crimes might need to be solved quickly, and that sometimes the most obvious suspect was the most convenient, regardless of actual guilt. The barn fell silent except for the sound of snow pattering against the roof. Clara could see the implications dawning on the faces around her. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was deliberate framing. "There's more," Ephraim said, his voice now hard with suppressed anger. "Dr. Morrison goes on to describe how James Hartwell asked specific questions about the bank's security, the president's daily schedule, and the best times to find the building less heavily guarded." Sheriff Bradley swore under his breath. He was planning the robbery himself, and planning to blame it on a grieving stranger who'd be too broken to defend himself properly. Clara added, understanding flooding through her. "Someone who'd be easy to convict and execute." Ephraim nodded, carefully folding the letter. "Dr. Morrison sealed this testimony and gave it to me the night Rose died. He said if anything happened to him, and he seemed to expect it might, I should take the letter to Judge Hartwell, James's father. Said the judge was an honest man who'd see justice done." "But you never delivered it," Bradley observed. "How could I?" Ephraim's voice cracked with the weight of old pain. "My daughter was dead. Dr. Morrison was talking about murders and conspiracies, and all I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. I took Rose to the river and buried her, then rode out of town like my life depended on it." "Which it probably did," Clara said softly. "If James Hartwell was willing to kill the bank president to cover his tracks, what would he have done to you?" Ephraim pulled another document from the envelope, a death certificate, bearing Dr. Morrison's official seal. "Rose Boone. Died September 15th, 1869, at 11:47 in the morning, from complications of pneumonia. Witnessed by Dr. James Morrison and Ephraim Boone, father." The timestamp was crucial, Clara realized. It proved beyond doubt that Ephraim had been holding his dying daughter at the exact time the bank was being robbed. "Why didn't you come forward with this before?" asked Hendricks, though his earlier hostility had been replaced by something approaching sympathy. "Because I was a coward," Ephraim said simply. "Because I was so broken by losing Rose that I couldn't face the idea of a trial, of having to relive that day over and over in court. Because I thought if I just disappeared, the whole nightmare would go away." "But it didn't go away," Clara said gently. "It followed you. Everywhere I went, I heard whispers, saw wanted posters. Had to keep moving, keep my head down." Ephraim looked directly at her. "Until I came here. Until I found people who saw something in me besides a wanted man." Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, this letter, if it's authentic, changes everything. But we'll need to verify Dr. Morrison's handwriting, check the official seals." "The fire that killed Dr. Morrison," Clara said suddenly. "When exactly did it happen?" Ephraim consulted the papers again. "October 20, about 2 weeks after Rose died, just like I told you." Convenient timing, Bradley muttered, right after he'd written testimony that could implicate James Hartwell in murder. The implications hung heavy in the cold air. A doctor who'd witnessed too much, a letter that could clear an innocent man and condemn a guilty one, a fire that destroyed all evidence except for the single copy Ephraim had carried for 3 months. "There's something else," Ephraim said quietly. He reached into the envelope one more time and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Clara saw a silver watch, tarnished with age. This belonged to the bank president, Martin Cooley. Dr. Morrison said James Hartwell left it behind in his office after their meeting probably fell out of his pocket while he was making threats. Morrison kept it as insurance in case he needed proof of Hartwell's involvement. Sheriff Bradley examined the watch, noting the initials MC engraved on the back. "How do we know this actually belonged to the murdered man?" "Because," Ephraim said, "Dr. Morrison had treated Cooley for heart problems. The watch has a secret compartment that holds his heart medication. Morrison wrote down the type and dosage in his letter information only Cooley's doctor would know." Clara watched the faces around her transform as the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just proof of Ephraim's innocence, it was evidence pointing to the real killer. "Mr. Boone," Sheriff Bradley said formally, "I owe you an apology, and Canyon County owes you justice." Ephraim stood slowly, the weight of 3 months' fear and secrecy lifting from his shoulders. "All I want is to clear my name, to stop running, to—" his eyes found Clara's across the dim barn. "To build a life worth living again." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, relief and love and hope mingling together in her chest. "You already have," she whispered. "You already have." Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside the barn, the air had warmed with the heat of truth finally spoken. Ephraim Boone was no longer a wanted man running from his past, was an innocent man ready to face his future. But first, there was the matter of James Hartwell, who had killed 2 men and let a third carry the blame. Justice, Clara thought, was long overdue. "Sheriff," she said, her voice strong with determination, "what happens now?" Bradley folded the letter carefully, his expression grim with purpose. "Now we make sure the right man pays for his crimes, and we make sure Mr. Boone here gets the life he deserves." As they prepared to leave the barn, Clara caught Ephraim's arm. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why tell the truth now? You could have run again, disappeared somewhere else." Ephraim looked down at her, his eyes holding all the warmth that had been missing when he first arrived. "Because Rose once told me that running away never solves anything, it just makes the problem bigger. And because," he paused, his voice growing soft, "because I found something here worth fighting for." Clara understood. She'd found something worth fighting for, too. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Sheriff Bradley had sent urgent telegrams to Canyon County, requesting that Judge Hartwell come to Bitter Creek to review the evidence against his son. The response came back within hours. The judge would arrive on Friday's stage, accompanied by a federal marshal and additional documentation about the bank robbery case. Clara found herself torn between hope and anxiety. While Dr. Morrison's letter clearly established Ephraim's innocence, she worried about what would happen when they confronted James Hartwell's family directly. Powerful men didn't always let justice stand in the way of protecting their own. "You're wearing a path in that floor," Ephraim observed from where he sat at her kitchen table, helping Samuel carve a wooden horse. The past few days had transformed him. The constant tension of being hunted had finally left his shoulders, replaced by a quiet confidence Clara found deeply attractive. "I can't help it," Clara admitted, pausing by the window to watch for the 100th time for signs of the approaching stage. "What if Judge Hartwell doesn't believe the evidence? What if he protects his son?" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Ephraim said simply. "But from what I remember, Judge Hartwell has a reputation for fairness. Dr. Morrison trusted him enough to suggest I bring the letter to him." Emma looked up from her own carving project. The wooden fish had evolved into something that might generously be called a mermaid. "Will you have to go away if the judge doesn't believe you?" The question hung in the air, like a weight. Clara realized that while she'd been focused on clearing Ephraim's name, her children had been facing the possibility of losing another father figure. The thought made her chest tighten with fierce protectiveness. "I'm not going anywhere," Ephraim said firmly, meeting Emma's worried gaze. "Whatever happens with the judge, this is my home now, if you'll have me." Samuel dropped his carving and launched himself at Ephraim with the impulsive affection of a 6-year-old. "We'll have you, won't we, Mama?" Clara felt her heart skip as both children turned expectant faces toward her. The question they were really asking had nothing to do with the legal proceedings and everything to do with the family they'd become without quite realizing it. "Yes," she said softly, "we'll have you." The smile that spread across Ephraim's face was like sunrise after a long night. For a moment, the worry about judges and trials and justice faded in the face of something simpler and more powerful, the promise of a future together. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Clara opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing on her porch, looking uncharacteristically subdued. "Clara, dear," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Clara replied, though her voice was cautious. "Come in out of the cold." Mrs. Patterson entered, nodding politely to Ephraim and the children before accepting Clara's offer of coffee. She sat at the table with unusual formality, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I came to apologize," she said without preamble, "and to offer my support, if you'll have it." Clara nearly dropped her coffee cup. "I'm sorry? Sheriff Bradley told me about the letter, about what really happened in Canyon County." Mrs. Patterson's voice was thick with embarrassment. "I was wrong to spread gossip about Mr. Boone, wrong to question your judgment. I let fear and prejudice guide my tongue when I should have trusted the character you saw in him." Ephraim set down his carving knife. "Mrs. Patterson, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted firmly. "A good man's reputation was nearly destroyed because I couldn't mind my own business. The least I can do is publicly acknowledge my mistake." She turned back to Clara. "I've spoken to the other ladies in town. We want you to know that when Judge Hartwell arrives, you won't be facing this alone. The whole community will be watching, and we'll make sure the truth is heard." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Dolores. That means more than you know." "It's the least we can do," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Besides, I've watched Mr. Boone with your children these past weeks. Any man who can make Samuel laugh the way he has, who can teach Emma to carve with such patience, that's not the kind of man who commits murder." After Mrs. Patterson left, carrying promises to spread word of the community's support, Clara found herself feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. Whatever happened when Judge Hartwell arrived, they wouldn't face it alone. That evening, as Clara tucked the children into bed, Emma caught her hand. "Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Boone?" The question was asked with the matter-of-fact directness that children brought to complicated adult situations. Clara felt her cheeks warm. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because he makes you smile the way Papa used to, and he looks at you like Papa did like. You're the most important thing in the world." Clara sat on the edge of Emma's bed, considering her words carefully. "Would you want me to marry Mr. Boone?" "I think Papa would want you to be happy," Emma said seriously. "And Mr. Boone makes you happy. He makes all of us happy." From the other bed, Samuel's sleepy voice added, "And he promised to teach me how to make Rose's rock towers. I want to learn that." Clara kissed both children goodnight and walked slowly back to the kitchen, where Ephraim was banking the fire for the night. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression made him straighten. "Everything all right?" "Emma asked if I was going to marry you," Clara said, deciding directness was the best approach. Ephraim went very still. "What did you tell her?" "I asked what she thought about the idea." Clara moved closer, her heart beating fast with nervous courage. "She seems to think it would be a good idea." "And what do you think?" Clara looked at this man who'd arrived broken and desperate, who'd slowly healed alongside her family, who'd faced his demons and chosen to fight rather than run. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'd like to hear what you think first." Ephraim set down the poker he'd been holding and turned to face her fully. "I think," he said, his voice low and warm, "that 3 months ago I wanted to die. I thought there was nothing left worth living for." He stepped closer, close enough that Clara could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I think finding this family saved my life in ways I'm still discovering. I think Rose would be happy to know that her papa found love again, found children to care for and protect." Clara's breath caught as he reached up to cup her face gently in his scarred hands. "I think," he continued, "that I love you, Clara Wynn. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see good in broken things. I love your children as if they were my own. And if you'll trust me with your heart and your future, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of that gift." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you, and I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just survival." When Ephraim kissed her, gentle and sure, Clara tasted the promise of second chances. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, but inside her kitchen, wrapped in the arms of a good man, she felt completely safe. "When this is over," Ephraim murmured against her hair, "when my name is cleared and the real killer is brought to justice, will you marry me, Clara?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant sunlight that made the snow-covered prairie look like a field of diamonds. Clara dressed with unusual care, choosing her best dress and pinning her hair up with the silver combs Thomas had given her for their first anniversary. The stage was due at noon, and by 11:30 half the town had gathered at Sheriff Bradley's office to witness the proceedings. Clara was grateful for their presence. Whatever happened, the truth would be heard by many ears. At precisely 12 o'clock, the stage rounded the bend into town. Through its windows, Clara could see 3 passengers, an elderly man with white hair and a stern but kind face, a younger man wearing a marshal's badge, and a woman in expensive traveling clothes who could only be Mrs. Hartwell. Judge William Hartwell stepped down from the stage with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was tall and lean, with intelligent eyes that took in the assembled crowd with careful assessment. "Sheriff Bradley," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for bringing this matter to my attention. I understand you have evidence regarding the Canyon County bank robbery." "Yes, sir," Bradley replied. "Evidence that will clear an innocent man and implicate the real killer." Judge Hartwell's eyes found Ephraim in the crowd. "Mr. Boone, I presume. You've been carrying quite a burden these past months." "Yes, sir," Ephraim replied quietly, "but I'm ready to set it down now." As they all filed into the sheriff's office, Clara caught Judge Hartwell's arm. "Your Honor, before you see the evidence, I want you to know Mr. Boone is a good man. Whatever your son may have done, it doesn't change the fact that Ephraim Boone is innocent." The judge studied her face with eyes that held deep sadness. "Mrs. Wynn, Clara Wynn. Mrs. Wynn, I've spent 30 years on the bench learning to separate truth from lies. If Mr. Boone is innocent, the evidence will prove it. And if my son is guilty," his voice broke slightly, "then justice will be served, regardless of my personal feelings." Clara nodded, understanding that Judge Hartwell was a man caught between duty and love, between justice and family. It couldn't be easy to investigate your own child for murder. As they gathered around Sheriff Bradley's desk, Dr. Morrison's letter spread out for all to see. Clara felt the weight of the moment. Everything they'd built together, their love, their family, their future, depended on the next hour. Ephraim reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sheriff's office had never held so many people. Clara found herself pressed against the wall between Mrs. Patterson and the blacksmith, all of them watching as Judge Hartwell examined Dr. Morrison's letter with the careful attention of a man whose world was shifting beneath his feet. Marshal Williams, a weathered man with kind eyes, had spread additional documents across Sheriff Bradley's desk: bank records, witness statements, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of the robbery. Mrs. Hartwell sat in the corner, her face pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "The handwriting is definitely Dr. Morrison's," Judge Hartwell said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of recognition. "I've seen enough of his medical reports over the years to be certain of that." He set down the letter and picked up the silver watch, turning it over in his weathered hands. "And this belonged to Martin Cooley. I gave it to him myself when he was first elected bank president." Clara felt her heart racing as she watched the judge's face transform from skepticism to grim certainty. The evidence was undeniable, but she could see the cost of accepting it in the lines around his eyes. "Marshal Williams," Judge Hartwell said formally, "what do your bank records show about the timeline of the robbery?" Williams consulted his papers. "Bank opened at 9. Robbery occurred at approximately 10:30 during the morning rush when several customers were present. President Cooley was shot during the robbery, died within minutes according to witnesses. And Mr. Boone's whereabouts during this time are documented where? In Dr. Morrison's medical log, which we recovered from his colleague's office before coming here," Williams replied. "Entry shows Rose Boone admitted at 6 a.m. with advanced pneumonia, father present throughout treatment. Time of death recorded as 11:47 a.m. Judge Hartwell closed his eyes briefly. So Ephraim Boone was holding his dying daughter's hand, while someone else was robbing the bank and murdering Martin Cooley. "Yes, sir," Williams confirmed. "The timeline makes it physically impossible for Mr. Boone to have committed these crimes." The room was silent except for the whisper of papers and the soft sound of Mrs. Hartwell weeping quietly in her corner. Clara watched Ephraim's face, seeing 3 months of fear and guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. "There's more," Williams continued, his voice gentle but firm. "We found additional evidence in Canyon County after your son's arrest yesterday." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally cracked completely, and Judge Hartwell aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "James has been arrested?" he asked quietly. "Yesterday morning, based on the evidence Mr. Boone provided. When we searched his rooms, we found bank documents that should have been destroyed in the robbery, as well as a significant amount of cash hidden in his personal effects." Williams pulled out another document. "We also found this, a letter from James to an associate discussing his plan to frame the grieving father for the robbery. Apparently, he'd been watching Mr. Boone since he arrived in town and saw an opportunity to create a perfect scapegoat." Clara felt sick, imagining the cold calculation that had gone into destroying Ephraim's life. To plan a murder and then deliberately frame an innocent manor-man who was burying his own child showed a level of cruelty that made her shudder. "Why?" Judge Hartwell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would James do such a thing? We weren't poor, weren't desperate." "Gambling debts," Williams replied with obvious reluctance. "Your son owed significant money to some dangerous people. The bank robbery was his way of settling those debts quickly." "And Dr. Morrison's death?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "Also James's doing. When Morrison refused to be intimidated into changing his testimony, James arranged for the fire. Made it look like an accident, but we found evidence of accelerant." The weight of his son's crimes settled over Judge Hartwell like a shroud. Clara found herself feeling sorry for the old man, despite everything. To learn that your child was a murderer, that had to be one of the worst burdens a parent could bear. "Your Honor," Ephraim said quietly, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began, "I want you to know I don't hold you responsible for your son's actions. You couldn't have known." Judge Hartwell looked up at him with eyes full of pain and gratitude. "You're very generous, Mr. Boone. More generous than I deserve, perhaps." "We all make choices," Ephraim replied. "Your son made his, you made yours. They're not the same thing." Marshal Williams cleared his throat. "Judge, I need to ask, will you be recusing yourself from your son's trial?" "Of course," Judge Hartwell replied immediately. "Judge Morrison from the next county will handle the case. I'll testify as a character witness if needed, but I won't preside over my own son's judgment." He stood slowly, looking every one of his 70 years. "Mr. Boone, On behalf of Canyon County and the state of Colorado, I formally apologize for the injustice you've suffered. Your name will be cleared completely, and restitution will be made for the hardship you've endured." Ephraim rose as well, extending his hand. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more than you know." As the two men shook hands, Clara felt the last piece of the nightmare finally fall into place. Ephraim was free, truly free to build the life he wanted. The crowd began to disperse, people filing out of the sheriff's office with the satisfied air of those who'd witnessed justice served. Mrs. Patterson squeezed Clara's arm before leaving. "I'm happy for you, dear," she whispered. "For all of you." When only the family remained, because that's what they were now, Clara realized, a family judge Hartwell approached them one final time. "Mrs. Wynn," he said, "thank you for standing by Mr. Boone when others might have turned away. Your loyalty may have saved his life." "He saved mine first," Clara replied simply. "We saved each other." Judge Hartwell nodded, understanding passing between them. "If you ever need anything at all, you need only ask. It's the least I can do." As the judge and marshal prepared to leave on the evening stage, Clara found herself standing in the street with Ephraim, watching the sun set over their small town. The nightmare was over. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. "So," she said, slipping her arm through his, "what happens now?" Ephraim smiled down at her, the expression free of shadows for the first time since she'd known him. "Now we plan a wedding. Now we build a life. Now we teach Samuel how to stack rocks like Rose used to, and we help Emma finish that mermaid. And we remember that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing that ever happens to you." He pulled her closer, his voice soft with wonder. "I lost my daughter, and I thought my life was over. But losing her led me to you, to Emma and Samuel, to this place where broken hearts can heal." Clara stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, right there in the middle of Main Street, not caring who saw. "I love you, Ephraim Boone." "I love you too, Clara Wynn, soon to be Clara Boone." The name sounded perfect to her ears. 3 days after Judge Hartwell's departure, Ephraim stood in the grove of cottonwoods behind Clara's house, carving his daughter's memorial. The wood was oak, the same piece Thomas had saved for something special, the same piece that had become Emma and Samuel's swing. It seemed fitting that part of it should honor the little girl whose death had led her father to this new family. Clara watched from a distance as Ephraim's careful hands shaped the cross, each stroke of his knife deliberate and loving. He'd been working on it since dawn, stopping only when Emma or Samuel needed his attention, but returning always to this final act of remembrance. The cross was simple but beautiful, carved with roses around the edges, and Rose's name in flowing script across the center. Below her name, Ephraim had added the words, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." "It's beautiful," Clara said, approaching quietly. Ephraim looked up from his work, wood shavings clinging to his clothes. "She would have liked it here," he said, gesturing to the peaceful grove. "She loved trees, loved the way the light looked filtering through leaves." "Will you tell me about her? Really tell me?" Clara settled on a fallen log beside him, close enough to share warmth in the cool afternoon air. Ephraim set down his carving knife and was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She was born on a spring morning during a thunderstorm. Her motherly wife Sarah said the thunder was just Rose announcing herself to the world." His voice grew soft with memory. "Sarah died 3 days later from complications the doctor couldn't fix, so it was just Rose and me from the very beginning." Clara reached out and took his hand, offering silent comfort. "She was the most curious child I ever knew, always asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do flowers come from? What happens to butterflies in winter?" I used to joke that she'd ask questions until she ran out of words. What did she look like? Dark hair like her mother's, brown eyes that seemed too big for her face. She had this smile. Ephraim's voice broke slightly. When she smiled, it was like watching the sun come up. Even on the darkest days, Rose could find something to smile about. Clara tried to imagine this bright, curious child, this little girl who'd been the center of Ephraim's world. She sounds wonderful. She was. She had this way of making friends wherever we went. Didn't matter if it was a gruff old storekeeper or a shy farm wife. Rose could charm anyone into conversation. Said there were no strangers in the world, just friends she hadn't met yet. Like Emma, Clara observed. Emma has that same gift with people. Ephraim smiled. Rose would have loved Emma, would have loved Samuel too. She always wanted brothers and sisters, used to make up imaginary ones when she got lonely. They love hearing stories about her, Clara said. It makes her real to them, makes her part of our family, even though she's gone. Is that how you think of it? Rose being part of our family? Clara considered the question carefully. I think love doesn't end when someone dies. I think Rose's love for you and yours for her becomes part of who you are. And when you share that with us, it becomes part of who we are too. Ephraim lifted the cross, examining his work in the slanting light. I used to think that moving on meant forgetting, that if I stopped grieving for Rose, it meant I didn't love her enough. And now I think Rose would want me to be happy, would want me to love and be loved, to help other children grow up safe and strong. He looked directly at Clara. I think she led me to you somehow. Call it God's plan or fate or just the way broken hearts find each other, I don't know, but I know I'm supposed to be here. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. I know you are too. From the house came the sound of children's laughter, Emma and Samuel playing some elaborate game that involved much running and shouting. The sound seemed to wrap around them like a blessing, a promise of life continuing, of joy persisting even in the shadow of loss. Will you help me plant this? Ephraim asked, indicating the cross. I want it to be something we do together, as a family. Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. They called the children, who came running with dirt-streaked faces and bright eyes. When Clara explained what they were doing, both Emma and Samuel grew serious with the gravity of the moment. Where should we put it? Emma asked. Ephraim studied the grove, finally pointing to a spot where the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves in golden shafts. There, where the light is prettiest. They dug together, taking turns with the shovel, making the hole deep enough to hold the cross steady. Samuel insisted on adding stones around the base to keep it safe, while Emma gathered wildflowers to plant nearby. When the cross was secure, they stood in a circle around it, hands joined. Ephraim spoke first. Rose, sweetheart, I want you to meet your new family. This is Clara, who's going to be your new mama. She's kind and strong and everything you would have loved about grown-up ladies. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as Ephraim continued. And these are Emma and Samuel, your new brother and sister. They're smart and funny and brave, and I know you would have loved playing with them. Emma stepped forward, her 8-year-old voice serious and sweet. Rose, I promise to take care of your papa, and I'll make sure Samuel learns how to stack rocks the way you did. Samuel, not to be outdone, added, and I'll share my wooden horse with you, even though you're in heaven and can't really play with it. Clara wiped her eyes and found her voice. Rose, thank you for raising such a good man. Thank you for teaching him how to love children, how to be patient and kind and strong. We'll take good care of him, and we'll make sure he's never lonely again. As the sun set through the cottonwoods, painting the memorial in warm gold light, Clara felt a sense of completion she hadn't expected. This wasn't an end, it was a beginning. A way of honoring the love that had shaped Ephraim while opening their hearts to the love that would shape their future. That evening, after the children were asleep, Clara found Ephraim sitting on the porch, staring up at the stars. She settled beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. Any regrets? She asked softly. About what? About choosing this? About choosing us? Ephraim turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. Clara, 3 months ago I rode into your yard wanting to die. Tonight I'm sitting here planning a wedding, looking forward to watching your children grow up, excited about the life we're going to build together. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and gleaming, a simple gold band, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's wedding ring," he said. "I've been carrying it since I left Missouri, not knowing why. Now I do." Clara's breath caught as he slipped from the step onto one knee, taking her hand in his. "Clara Wynn, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and your children? Will you help me build something beautiful from the pieces of our broken hearts?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, yes." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for her finger. As Ephraim kissed her under the prairie stars, Clara felt the last walls around her heart crumble away. She was ready to love again, ready to build again, ready to believe in happy endings. From somewhere in the distance came the soft hoot of an owl, and Clara chose to believe it was Rose, giving her blessing to the family that would carry her memory forward into all the bright tomorrows to come. 6 months later, Clara stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn for her wedding day. It wasn't elaborate prairie life, didn't allow for such luxuries, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, with pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother and lace trim salvaged from her wedding dress to Thomas. "You look beautiful, Mama," Emma said from the doorway, her own dress a soft blue that matched her eyes. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of prairie roses and wildflowers that she and Samuel had gathered that morning. "Thank you, sweetheart." Clara turned from the mirror, her heart full of nervous joy. "Are you ready for this? Ready to have Mr. Boone be your papa, officially?" Emma nodded solemnly. "He's been our papa in everything but name for months. This just makes it real." Through the window, Clara could see the guests gathering in the yard. The whole community had turned out for the wedding, not just out of curiosity, but out of genuine affection for the family that had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. Mrs. Patterson had organized the food, the blacksmith had built benches for seating, and Sheriff Bradley had offered to give Clara away, since she had no male relatives present. "Mama!" Samuel appeared beside Emma, fidgeting with his collar. "When do I give Mr. Boone the rings?" Clara knelt down to straighten his tie. "When Pastor Jenkins asks for them. Remember, you're the most important helper today." Samuel beamed with pride. He'd been practicing his ring-bearing duties for weeks, taking his responsibility very seriously. The rings, Clara's new wedding band, and a simple gold band for Ephraim, rested in a small wooden box that Ephraim had carved specially for the occasion. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked, with the perceptiveness of a child who'd grown up watching adults navigate complex emotions. "A little," Clara admitted. "But it's a good nervous, like the feeling you get before something wonderful is about to happen." In truth, she felt no real anxiety about marrying Ephraim. The past 6 months had only confirmed what her heart had known from almost the beginning, that this man was meant to be part of their family. He'd proven himself in countless small ways: the patient hour he'd spent teaching Samuel to whistle, the way he'd sat up all night when Emma had a fever, the gentle care he'd taken with Clara's feelings as she'd slowly removed her first wedding ring and put it away with her treasured memories of Thomas. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara," it was Sheriff Bradley's voice. "Pastor Jenkins says it's time." Clara took a deep breath, gathered her skirts, and walked with her children toward the door. As they stepped out onto the porch, the assembled guests turned to watch, their faces bright with smiles and good wishes. Ephraim stood at the front of the crowd, beside the large oak tree where Rose's swing still hung. He wore his best suit purchased specially for the occasion, and his face was transformed by a smile so radiant it took Clara's breath away. This was not the broken man who'd arrived at her homestead asking to work for free. This was a man renewed, ready to embrace all the happiness life could offer. Pastor Jenkins, a kindly man with white hair and gentle eyes, had positioned himself beneath the oak's spreading branches. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the small congregation. As Clara walked toward Ephraim, her children flanking her like honored escorts, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the formal recognition of the family they'd already become, the celebration of love that had grown from grief into something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined alone. When she reached Ephraim's side, he took her hands in his eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Jenkins began, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Clara Wynn and Ephraim Boone, and to celebrate the family they have built together." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They'd written their own vows, choosing words that reflected the unique path that had brought them together. "Clara," Ephraim said when his turn came, his voice steady and strong, "I came to your home a broken man, carrying nothing but grief and guilt. You gave me work when I needed purpose, shelter when I needed safety, and love when I thought I'd never feel worthy of it again. You and your children saved my life, and I promise to spend the rest of my days protecting and cherishing the gift of your love." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks as she spoke her own vows. "Ephraim, you arrived in our lives when we needed you most, though we didn't even know it. You brought laughter back to our home, strength to our daily struggles, and showed my children what it means to have a father's love again. I promise to love you, to support you, and to honor the memory of your daughter Rose by helping you live a life that would make her proud." When Pastor Jenkins called for the rings, Samuel stepped forward with the wooden box, his chest puffed out with importance. The rings slipped onto their fingers with the ease of things meant to be, completing the circle of promises they'd been making to each other for months. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Pastor Jenkins announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Ephraim's kiss was gentle but certain, a promise sealed before God and community. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Clara heard Emma and Samuel's delighted laughter rising above the noise. As they turned to face their guests as a married couple, Clara caught sight of something that made her heart skip. There, among the well-wishers, stood a small wooden cross beneath the Cottonwoods Roses memorial, visible from where they'd taken their vows. Somehow, it felt perfect that Rose should be present for this moment, her memory woven into the fabric of their new beginning. The celebration that followed was everything Clara could have hoped for. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by neighbors, children ran through the yard playing games, and the adults settled into the comfortable conversation of a community celebrating one of its own. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rose, Clara found herself standing with Ephraim beside Rose's memorial. Someone, probably Emma, had left fresh wildflowers at the base of the cross. "Do you think she approves?" Clara asked, slipping her arm around her husband's waist. The word husband still felt new and wonderful in her mind. Ephraim pulled her closer, his voice warm with contentment. "I think she's happy that her papa found love again, and I think she would have adored her new mama and siblings." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children play with the other young guests. Samuel was demonstrating his rock-stacking skills to an admiring audience, while Emma was organizing the younger children into some elaborate game that seemed to involve a great deal of giggling. "They're growing up so fast," Clara observed. "They are, but we'll have time to watch them become the people they're meant to be, time to guide them, protect them, love them." Ephraim's voice grew thoughtful. "I used to think time was something that could be stolen from you, something you could lose in an instant. Now I think time is something you create by choosing to build a life worth living, by making each day count." A year later, Clara sat on her porch, watching the familiar rhythm of her family's evening routine. Samuel, now 7 and tall for his age, was helping Ephraim repair a section of fence. Emma, approaching her 10th birthday with the confidence of a young woman, was teaching the chickens to come when called a project that amused the adults even if it frustrated her. The homestead had expanded under Ephraim's care. A new room had been added to the house, along with an improved barn and a workshop where Ephraim crafted furniture for their neighbors. The business was thriving, built on the reputation for quality and fairness that Ephraim had established in the community. But it was the small changes that meant the most to Clara. The way Samuel called Ephraim Papa without thinking about it. The way Emma sought Ephraim's advice on everything from arithmetic to the complexities of childhood friendships. The way their house was filled with laughter and conversation, the comfortable noise of a family that belonged together. "Mama," Emma called from the chicken coop, "I think Henrietta is going to lay eggs in the morning. Want to see?" Clara rose from her chair, her hand resting briefly on her still flat stomach. In a few months, she'd need to tell the children about the baby growing inside her Ephraim's child, the bridge between the family they'd built and the family they were becoming. For now, it was her and Ephraim's sweet secret, discussed in whispered conversations after the children were asleep. As she walked toward the chicken coop, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She'd thought, after Thomas died, that her story was over, that she'd spend the rest of her years simply surviving, raising her children alone on the harsh prairie. She'd never imagined that a broken stranger could become the foundation of a new kind of happiness. The sun was setting as the family gathered for supper, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Samuel chatted about his day, Emma shared a story from her reading lesson, and Ephraim listened with the patient attention of a man who understood that these simple moments were the stuff of which good lives were made. After the children were in bed, Clara and Ephraim sat on their porch, as they did every evening, watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. Clara wore her wedding ring now, instead of Thomas's, though she still kept his ring in a special box, along with her treasured memories of their life together. Love, she'd learned, didn't replace love-it, simply expanded the heart's capacity to hold more joy. "Any regrets?" Ephraim asked, echoing the question she'd posed to him on the night he'd proposed. "Only one," Clara said, settling more comfortably against his side. "What's that?" "I regret that it took loss to bring us together. I regret that Rose had to die for you to find us, that Thomas had to die for me to be free to love again. I wish there could have been a way for all of us to be happy together." Ephraim was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Maybe there was no other way," he said finally. "Maybe some stories can only be written with heartbreak as well as joy. Maybe that's what makes them worth telling." Clara thought about the wooden doll still carefully preserved in Ephraim's things, about Thomas's tools that Ephraim now used with reverent care, about the way her children spoke of their first papa and their papa Ephraim, as if both men had always been part of their story. "I think," she said slowly, "that love doesn't end when people die. It changes form, becomes part of new love, new families. Thomas's love for me helped me recognize real love when I found it again. Rose's love for you made you the kind of man who could love my children as your own. So they're still with us," Ephraim said, "just in a different way." "Always," Clara agreed, "always with us." From Rose's memorial came the soft sound of wind chamesa, recent addition that tinkled gently in the evening breeze. Emma had made them in Ephraim's workshop, saying that Rose should have music to dance to in heaven. The sound was peaceful, hopeful, like a lullaby sung by angels. Clara closed her eyes and listened, thinking about second chances and the mysterious ways that broken hearts could heal each other, about the families we're born into and the families we choose, about the love that survives death and the love that makes life worth living. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is watching someone you love slip away forever. But sometimes, Clara had learned, the soul you save isn't just theirs, it's yours too. And sometimes, just sometimes, saving each other is exactly what broken hearts are meant to do.